We know who was there that day.
Late 1944. A humid stillness hangs inside a small Allied field interrogation hut on Guam. The walls are thin plywood, the air faintly scented with dust, ink, and the distant burn of diesel engines. Outside, the low rumble of trucks mixes with the muffled calls of medics tending to the wounded. Inside, the room is silent, except for the soft shuffle of paper. On a wooden table rests a stack of black and white photographs, crisp images of Seattle, Brisbane, San Francisco, and Sydney. Clean streets, school children crossing sidewalks, women in sun hats browsing fruit stalls, streetcars rolling past tidy neighborhoods untouched by war. Across from the table sit 3 Japanese women POWs, a nurse from Saipan, a communications clerk from Guam, and a volunteer aide captured near Tinian. Their uniforms are worn, their faces hollow from exhaustion and fear. For months, they had been told that America's cities were crumbling under bombardment, that civilians lived in terror, that chaos ruled beyond Japan's islands. The interpreter gently turns the first photograph toward them. Their eyes widen, not in curiosity, but in disbelief. And that disbelief is where the deeper story begins, a story shaped long before these photographs were ever placed on the table. The shock that spread across the faces of those women in the interrogation hut was not sudden. It was the result of years of controlled information, rigid ideology, and a wartime environment where truth became a strategic weapon. To understand why a simple photograph of a peaceful city could shatter their certainty, we must step back into the world they came from, a world shaped by Japan's military state, expanding conflict, and a narrative that allowed no room for doubt. By 1944, Japan's war had entered a desperate phase. The empire that once surged across the Pacific now struggled to defend islands one by one as Allied forces advanced with overwhelming naval and air power. Japanese society had shifted completely into wartime footing. Civilians were mobilized. Industry was strained. Food shortages crept into major cities. And information, every newspaper line, every radio broadcast, every classroom lesson, had become an instrument of national cohesion. For Japanese women, especially those raised in the 1930s, duty and loyalty were taught from early childhood. Patriotism was intertwined with self-sacrifice. Many worked long hours as factory laborers, nurses, or administrative support in military units. Others volunteered for the Women's Volunteer Corps or Red Cross auxiliaries. Their lives were tightly surrounded by messages that glorified endurance and warned of the enemy's brutality. To these women, America and the Allied nations were not simply distant countries. They were described as collapsing societies, immoral, violent, divided, and suffering under the strain of war. Propaganda leaflets, broadcasts, and military instructors repeated the same lines. Allied bombings had destroyed major American cities. Civilians lived in panic. Crime was rampant. Hunger was widespread. The idea of an Allied world functioning normally was nearly unthinkable. This environment shaped every decision they made. When many of these women were sent to Pacific Island garrisons, Saipan, Guam, Peleliu, Tinian, they brought with them the certainty that Japanese forces were fighting a righteous defensive war against an enemy bent on annihilation. They believed that if captured, they would face atrocities. That belief drove some to hide, others to attempt suicide, and many to avoid surrender until the moment they had no choice. Then came 1944, the fall of Saipan in July, Guam shortly after, and the collapse of Japanese positions across the Mariana Islands produced the largest number of Japanese women POWs of the entire war. Most were clerks, nurses, typists, or support staff. They emerged from caves, bomb shelters, and shattered buildings in shock, dehydrated, and terrified of the fate awaiting them. Their fear was so deep that Allied medics often recorded the same reaction: disbelief that they were receiving food, water, or medical care. For the Allies, these first encounters revealed something unexpected: the depth of Japanese wartime indoctrination. Women who had never seen an American civilian believed the United States had been burning for years. Some thought San Francisco no longer existed. Others believed Australian cities were under constant siege. Many claimed Japan was winning the war decisively. News of defeats had been concealed or reframed as heroic last stands. This confusion triggered a new interest among Allied intelligence teams. They needed to understand how these beliefs shaped morale, resistance, and behavior among both soldiers and civilians. They needed to know why surrender was resisted so fiercely and what psychological barriers existed. So interrogators changed their approach. Instead of pressing with aggressive questioning, they introduced a new tool, something simple, yet unexpectedly powerful: photographs. Intelligence officers began collecting images from newspapers, family albums, and government archives. They chose scenes that showed ordinary life, not military strength. Children playing, couples shopping, farmers harvesting wheat, buses full of workers heading to factories unscarred by war. These images offered something unmistakable: evidence that contradicted the Japanese wartime narrative. It was not meant to humiliate. It was meant to reveal the psychological landscape these women carried with them. And when the first photographs were quietly placed before them, their reactions confirmed something profound: a disconnect between the world they imagined and the world that actually existed, a disconnect that would become the focal point of the interrogations that followed. The story of those reactions, sometimes silent, sometimes emotional, always revealing, forms the foundation for understanding the next phase of this wartime encounter. As Allied forces secured their positions across the Marianas, the handling of prisoners, especially Japanese women, became an urgent matter of both humanitarian responsibility and intelligence value. Unlike male prisoners, whose capture was expected in major battles, the appearance of women on the front lines surprised many Allied units. Their presence revealed how deeply Japan had mobilized its population and how far the reach of military propaganda extended into civilian life. Allied policy for Japanese POWs was governed by the Geneva Convention, though Japan itself had not ratified it. Despite the brutal fighting on Saipan and Guam, Allied commanders recognized that mistreatment would only reinforce Japanese fears and encourage resistance. Camps were established with separate quarters for women. Medical officers prioritized treatment of the wounded, including pregnant women and those suffering from dehydration after hiding in caves for days. But the difficulty was not the logistics of care. The difficulty was communication. Many women refused to speak at first. Some were convinced that any admission of knowledge would lead to execution. Others tried to repeat official Japanese slogans, even while trembling with exhaustion. A few remained silent for days, responding only through interpreters with tightly measured words. Allied interrogators soon realized they were facing not just captives, but individuals whose entire worldview was constructed on narratives that bore little resemblance to observable reality. This is where the photographs became essential. The idea began in the intelligence offices on Guam and Saipan. How do you uncover truth from someone whose only understanding of the world has been shaped by controlled wartime messaging? How do you break through fear without coercion? The interrogators chose a method that required no threats, no force, only clarity. They gathered photographs from soldiers' personal kits, Allied newspapers, and wartime information bureaus. The images varied widely. Quiet residential streets in Sydney, children buying ice cream in Honolulu, a sunny afternoon in San Francisco's Market Street. Women working in an American aircraft plant, smiling during a break, crowds attending a baseball game in Chicago, a peaceful Brisbane tram stop, farmers tending to large, healthy crops in Kansas and Queensland. None of these scenes matched the Japanese women's expectations. They had been told Allied cities were starving, burning, collapsing into riot and disorder. Seeing orderly streets and well-fed civilians directly challenged those beliefs. For the Allies, this psychological confrontation was not merely academic. Understanding Japanese morale was essential. If civilians believed surrender meant torture or death, they would resist even when defeat was inevitable. If soldiers believed their homeland was winning, they would refuse to lay down their arms. The photographs offered interrogators the first tangible way to measure how deep these convictions ran. Reports from intelligence officers described the reactions: hesitation, confusion, long silences, sudden questions. Some women looked away quickly, as if the images were dangerous. Others leaned in, studying details, the clothing, the expressions, the lack of fear in the faces of Allied civilians. A few whispered comments revealing their shock. So their cities are not destroyed? These reactions provided invaluable insights into the psychological climate inside Japan. The women's disbelief also reflected another truth. Japan's own cities were suffering. By 1944, Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and many regional centers had experienced growing shortages and increasing air raid alerts. Neighborhoods built largely of wood were vulnerable to firestorms. Evacuations of children were underway. Civilians understood hardship, even if the causes were masked by official propaganda. The contrast between these realities and the peaceful Allied photographs created an emotional collision, one that interrogators recorded with careful detail. Their goal was not to shame the captives, but to understand the machinery of belief that had shaped millions of Japanese citizens. This contrast would soon lead to the next stage of the narrative, the multiple perspectives through which this moment can be understood. The human shock, the strategic implications, the cultural weight, all interconnected to reveal a larger truth about wartime perception. And it is through these angles that the full meaning of those photographs becomes visible. For years before these women were captured, Japan's wartime machinery cultivated a controlled and carefully curated worldview. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, school lessons, and military directives all operated under strict state oversight. Their purpose was simple: reinforce unity, encourage sacrifice, and maintain confidence in ultimate victory. Within this system, the depiction of the enemy was never neutral. The Allies were presented not merely as opponents, but as symbols of moral decay and impending collapse. Government bulletins routinely exaggerated Allied casualties, described American cities as targets of constant internal turmoil, and insisted that food shortages overwhelmed Australia and the United States. Magazine sketches portrayed American streets in ruin, factories destroyed, and civilians wandering as refugees. Even fictionalized stories, printed as if they were factual accounts, described Allied society breaking under the strain of war. These narratives shaped the Japanese women serving in island garrisons. Many came from rural provinces with limited international exposure. Their understanding of foreign nations came almost entirely from imperial messaging. To them, the idea that American or Australian civilians lived comfortably was not just improbable, it was incompatible with everything they had been taught. So when the Allied interrogators gently laid out photographs of peaceful cities, it was more than simple evidence. It was a rupture in the structure of belief, a direct contradiction to the mental world built around them. The propaganda system they trusted had not simply shaded the truth, it had inverted it. The shock that followed was not only emotional, but profoundly destabilizing. And that shock reveals the next layer of this event, the human response itself. The first reaction many Japanese women POWs experienced when seeing the photographs was not intellectual. It was emotional. Their eyes lingered on faces, on buildings untouched by war, on the posture of civilians who walked without fear. The contrast was painful because it reminded them of their own homeland's growing hardships and the propaganda-driven expectations they carried into captivity. Some wept quietly, not from sentimentality, but from disorientation. For months, they had lived inside a collapsing battlefield environment. Starvation caves on Saipan, bomb-shattered hospitals on Guam, shelters filled with wounded civilians. To see images of children smiling in schoolyards or shoppers strolling beneath sunlit storefronts triggered a sense of disbelief bordering on grief. Others reacted with suspicion. They asked whether the photographs were staged, perhaps taken before the war. But the modern cars, the wartime factory uniforms, the visible presence of soldiers on leave proved otherwise. The details were too contemporary to dismiss. For a few, the emotional reaction was shame. They had believed they were fighting to protect Japan from a monstrous invader. Yet the people in the photographs did not appear monstrous. They appeared ordinary, perhaps even happier than civilians at home. A small number refused to look at all. Their fear was deep, tied not only to propaganda, but to loyalty. To acknowledge the truth meant acknowledging that the war's narrative had been false, a realization that carried personal and cultural weight. These deeply human responses revealed more than surprise. They revealed the fragile line between perception and reality, a line that Allied intelligence sought to understand next. To Allied interrogators, the reactions of Japanese women POWs were not merely emotional events. They were critical pieces of psychological data. Intelligence teams in the Pacific were still struggling to understand why Japanese soldiers and civilians resisted surrender so fiercely. Fear and propaganda were suspected factors, but the depth of these influences was unclear. The photographs created a controlled testing moment. Interrogators could observe how captives processed information that contradicted everything they had been told. They noted whether disbelief shifted into curiosity, whether fear softened, or whether resistance hardened. Each response provided insight into the mindset Japanese civilians carried into battle zones. Reports indicate that Allied analysts paid close attention to small details. The questions the women asked, the length of their silence, the way they exchanged glances. These subtle indicators helped intelligence officers map the internal structure of Japanese morale. How strongly women believed in the government line, how fragile that belief became under pressure, and how cultural concepts of loyalty shaped their ability to accept new realities. The women's reactions also helped the Allies understand the challenges they would face in future operations, especially in regions where Japanese civilians lived under similar beliefs. If even peaceful photographs caused distress, then preparing for larger surrenders would require careful psychological planning to prevent panic, suicides, or resistance. Thus, the photograph sessions were not accidental curiosities. They were valuable intelligence experiments, and they laid the foundation for understanding the deeper cultural and moral angles that shaped the war's human landscape. To understand the reactions of the Japanese women POWs, one must consider the cultural weight they carried. In 1940s Japan, loyalty was not merely a virtue. It was a framework through which identity itself was understood. Concepts such as obligation, giri, duty, and meo, honor, deeply shaped behavior. For women serving in military roles, these principles held even greater intensity. Their duty was not only to the state, but to their families, their ancestors, and the communities that had entrusted them with service. Accepting the truth of the Allied photographs meant confronting a cultural dilemma. If American cities were peaceful and intact, then the warnings they had been taught were false. If their government had misled them, even partially, then their loyalty had been built on misinformation. That realization, in Japanese wartime culture, carried an emotional burden far heavier than simple surprise. Some women felt shame, not because they had personally acted wrongly, but because acknowledging the photograph's truth implied a breach in loyalty. Others feared that admitting the images were real would dishonor their families or their units. They had sworn devotion to an empire portrayed as moral and besieged. To face evidence that contradicted this narrative created internal conflict that could not be easily resolved. This cultural weight explains why some women reacted with tears and others with silence. It was not only disbelief, it was the painful clash between cultural duty and emerging truth. And that clash directly shaped how they perceived the broader world beyond Japan's wartime borders. By 1944, the lived reality of civilians in Japan stood in stark contrast to the stability seen in Allied cities. American and Australian industrial centers were operating at peak efficiency. Food production remained high. Civilian life, though marked by rationing and war mobilization, still retained normal rhythms. Schools open, businesses active, leisure activities intact. To Allied citizens, the war was a distant but constant presence. To Japanese civilians, it was an immediate and escalating pressure. Urban Japan faced mounting hardships. Air raid sirens disrupted daily routines. Blackouts darkened entire cities. Fuel shortages crippled transportation. Food scarcity worsened as shipping lanes collapsed under submarine attacks. Families lived with the dread of firebombing, which would soon devastate Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and dozens of regional towns. For the Japanese women, POWs, these pressures were familiar. Many came from cities where rice rations had grown smaller, where children carried evacuation tags around their necks, where families dug emergency trenches beside their homes. When they saw photographs of healthy Allied civilians walking past well-stocked shops, the images did more than challenge propaganda. They forced a comparison with their own homeland suffering. The contrast was not subtle. It was overwhelming. Some women whispered that the civilians in the photos looked too calm. Others studied the food stalls, noting the abundance of fruit and vegetables rarely seen in Japan by 1944. A few stared at the buildings, recognizing the absence of bomb damage they had been told existed. The photographs did not merely show a different world. They showed two civilizations experiencing completely different wars. And this disparity revealed the deeper moral dimension that underpinned the entire encounter. War distorts truth. It reshapes information, narrows perspective, and turns rumor into certainty. For the Japanese women, POWs, the photographs represented more than foreign images. They represented a moral confrontation with the nature of wartime reality. Their government had insisted that the Allies sought Japan's destruction, that American society was decaying, and that surrender would bring unspeakable horrors. These beliefs were not abstract. They governed decisions and shaped fears. But the photographs told a different story, one of functioning schools, calm marketplaces, organized transportation systems, and civilians who did not look cruel, vengeful, or desperate. The moral shock lay not in the images themselves, but in the realization that truth had been filtered through a lens intended to sustain national resolve at any cost. For some women, this realization sparked confusion. For others, it triggered anger, not necessarily at Japan, but at the internal dissonance created by conflicting truths. A few felt guilt, wondering how much of their loyalty had been anchored to assumptions rather than facts. The moral angle also extended to the Allies. Interrogators recorded their own reflections on how difficult it was to present truth without overwhelming the captives emotionally. They recognized that the women were not naive. They were shaped by a system that demanded absolute belief. The photographs, therefore, became a moral mirror. They revealed the vulnerability of human perception under the strain of war and the delicate balance between belief and evidence. This convergence of cultural weight, emotional shock, and moral realization set the stage for the most intense moment of the narrative, the turning point inside the interrogation room. The interrogation room on Guam was quiet except for the sound of the interpreter's gentle breathing. The women sat rigidly, hands placed neatly on their laps, eyes fixed on the photographs before them. What followed in the next minutes, recorded in Allied intelligence summaries, became one of the most revealing psychological moments of the Pacific War. The interpreter pushed forward a photograph of San Francisco's Market Street, taken only months earlier. Streetcars hummed past storefronts. Civilians crossed intersections carrying shopping bags. A soldier on leave shared a laugh with two young women. Nothing about the scene resembled the descriptions the prisoners had heard back home. Descriptions of a battered, starving America on the brink of collapse. The first woman, a nurse captured on Saipan, leaned forward slightly. She had spent months treating wounded soldiers in cave hospitals, working with dwindling supplies under constant bombardment. Her idea of city life had become synonymous with chaos and noise, mostly from air raids. When she saw the photograph, her lips parted as if she were about to speak, but no sound came. Instead, she studied the shadows, the clothing, the posture of the civilians. Her eyes widened when she noticed the abundance of food in a shop window behind the streetcar. A second woman, a communications clerk, broke the silence. Speaking in a quiet voice, she asked the interpreter, "What year?" 1944, he replied. Her shoulders stiffened. "This is impossible." "It is recent," he assured her. "Taken during the war." Her disbelief was evident. She raised a trembling hand and pointed at the photograph. "We were told American cities are destroyed, that their people are wandering, that they have no food." Her voice cracked on the final word. The interpreter did not respond with argument or persuasion. He simply laid out another photograph, this time of Brisbane. A line of school children crossed a sunny street, carrying books and lunch pails. Women rode bicycles down the sidewalk. In the distance stood a row of tidy houses with untouched roofs. The third woman, a volunteer aide captured during the fall of Tinian, pressed a hand to her face. She had lived through repeated shelling and had seen fires sweep through Japanese civilian quarters on the island. To her, the sight of a city without rubble was incomprehensible. She whispered something in Japanese. The interpreter later translated it as, "Why do they lie to us?" But not all reactions were accepting. One of the women drew back, refusing to meet the photographs with her gaze. The interpreter recorded her response. "These are old, before the war. They cannot be war photographs." Her denial was not stubbornness. It was a shield against shame and fear. Accepting the images meant accepting a world she had never imagined. It meant questioning the authority figures she had trusted since childhood. The interrogator did not push. He quietly produced newspapers dated only weeks earlier, showing Allied cities holding wartime parades and factory celebrations. Headlines described production increases, not destruction. The photographs, still warm from the printing presses, left little room for misinterpretation. At this point, the nurse spoke again, her voice soft. "Then what of Japan?" The interpreter paused, aware of the fragility of the moment. "Japan fights on," he answered carefully. "But Japan's cities have suffered more than ours. You know this." The nurse closed her eyes. She had treated civilians injured in air raids before being dispatched to Saipan. She knew the truth, even if she had never been allowed to say it. For the first time since her capture, her composure broke. Tears slid down her cheeks, not from fear of the Allies, but from the realization that the world she believed in, the world she served had not been entirely as she was told. The other women watched her silently. Something in the room shifted. The tension that had hung in the air since the start of the session loosened, replaced by a quiet, heavy understanding shared among them. They were confronting not just evidence, but an entire structure of belief unraveling before their eyes. The interrogators recorded every detail in their reports. They noted how the women exchanged glances, how their hands tightened around their knees, how their stamina seemed to waver under the weight of new information. This was more than intelligence gathering. It was the moment the psychological front line of the war became visible. In the final minutes of the session, the communications clerk looked at the interpreter and asked, "If this is true, then what else have we not been told?" That question, fragile, hesitant, and filled with dawning realization, would become the pivot upon which the next phase of the interrogation turned. It marked the beginning of a profound shift, one that intelligence officers recognized immediately. For once a person begins to question the foundation of their wartime beliefs, everything that follows becomes a turning point. The room stays still for a long moment. The three women, exhausted, disciplined, conditioned to suppress emotion, sit upright, hands folded in their laps. Their expressions remain neutral, but their eyes begin to flicker in small, involuntary movements. The photographs placed before them are too detailed, too ordinary, too alive. The interpreter slides another set forward. A crowded baseball stadium in California. A bustling department store in Chicago. A tram filled with schoolchildren in Sydney. A quiet residential street in Vancouver. Maple leaves piled on the sidewalk. Each photograph tells the same story. Life continues. Shops open. Children laugh. Buildings stand unbroken. The women lean forward without realizing it. And now, the subtle tremor of their beliefs begins to crack. The nurse from Saipan stiffens, her posture tightening into a rigid line. She was raised in a village where radios were rare and newspapers heavily filtered. For years, her only images of the outside world came through imperial broadcasts. Her gaze stays locked on a photograph of a Seattle waterfront. Ferries gliding across the water, office towers rising behind them, smoke drifting from factory chimneys. She does not blink. Her knuckles whiten around her lap cloth. To her, the photograph is not merely surprising. It is impossible. According to the propaganda she'd grown up with, America was collapsing under Japanese pressure. Factories in ruins, cities bombed, civilians starving. A nation too fragile to withstand war. But here, in her hands, is proof of the opposite, vibrant, modern, organized. No amount of discipline can mask the tightening in her throat. The communications clerk, sharp-eyed, trained to detect enemy deception, reacts differently. Her eyebrows draw together. She searches for flaws, scanning the papers like intelligence reports. Wrong shadows, incorrect signage, evidence of photographic tampering. Her training tells her to dissect, not to feel. But the more she inspects, the more her anger grows, not at the Allies, but at the realization that she herself may have been deceived. She turns toward the interpreter and speaks through gritted teeth. "These are staged." The interpreter nods calmly. He slides forward a new set, this time stamped, dated, verified by multiple Allied press agencies, including photos published months before the battles in the Pacific even reached their peak. She examines them again. Her anger drains. A new, more devastating feeling replaces it: confusion. The youngest of the three, barely in her 20s, had grown up memorizing patriotic songs and slogans. She was taught since childhood that Japan's struggle was noble and America's destruction certain. Where others feel shock or anger, she feels something far more primal: fear. Not fear of the Americans in the room, who treat her calmly, even gently, but fear of what this truth means. If America is strong, if its cities thrive, if its people live untouched by destruction, then everything she had been told about the war's progress is a lie. A lie that affects not just soldiers at the front, but her family in Japan. Her voice trembles. She whispers only a single sentence. Then what is happening back home? A question that no one in the room can answer honestly. For years, the Imperial Home Ministry had fed its civilians, especially women, a carefully curated vision of the world. Japan advancing on all fronts. America weakened and chaotic. The Allies divided and demoralized. Victory not only possible, but imminent. These photographs do more than contradict the narrative. They obliterate it. One by one, the women stop speaking. They simply stare. The interpreter does not push. Allied interrogators knew from experience that truth cannot be forced. It can only be shown. Once internal contradiction begins, the mind continues the process on its own. And here, in this silent wooden hut on Guam, three minds begin rewriting years of conditioning. The nurse finally breaks the silence. Pointing at a photograph of a busy Australian market, she asks, "What year was this taken?" Her voice is flat, professional, but her eyes reveal a tremor of panic. "Last spring," the interpreter answers. She swallows hard. Spring. Months after she'd been told that Allied nations were starving. Months after Japanese radio claimed that America's economy was collapsing. The contradiction is too large to ignore. The clerk, the most offensive of the three, rubs her temples in frustration. She's trained to piece together information, but every piece she tries to place only highlights the scale of the deception surrounding her. Finally, she murmurs, "Why were we told these cities were destroyed?" There is no accusation in her voice, only profound betrayal. What the women do not say, what they cannot yet admit aloud, but what their eyes reveal in quiet, unguarded moments. If America is thriving, if Allied production is untouched, if their industrial output is still rising, then Japan cannot win this war. Not militarily, not economically, not technologically. This is the moment Allied intelligence always waited for. Not rage, not despair, but recognition. A recognition that opens the door to truthful conversation. One of the women studies a photograph of a California neighborhood. Children playing in a garden, sunlight reflecting off windows. A mother sits on the porch, reading. The young volunteer aide's eyes soften. She whispers, "They look peaceful." The interpreter nods. "They are." Another long silence. Then, quietly, "We were told Americans hated their women, that they were violent, disorderly, corrupt." The interpreter responds, gently, "You can judge for yourself." She sets the photograph down carefully, almost reverently, as if afraid to damage something fragile. The emotional pressure in the room finally reaches its peak. Tears gather at the edges of the youngest woman's eyes, not because of the images, but because of what they represent. The destruction of certainty, the collapse of ideology, the beginning of doubt. She covers her mouth with her sleeve. The nurse closes her eyes, trying to remain composed. The clerk grips the table so hard her nails bend. This is the true climax. Not a shout, not a confrontation, but a silent unraveling. A psychological turning point that no battlefield could achieve. The door closed softly behind the interrogators, leaving the three women alone in the room. Outside, the air hung warm and still, carrying the distant thrum of generators from the temporary Allied camp. Inside, the pictures remained scattered across the table. small paper windows into a world that contradicted everything they had been raised to believe. Hours had passed since the photographs were first shown, yet none of the women moved to gather them. Allied intelligence officers noted this detail carefully. The images were not dismissed or pushed away. They were studied, handled gently, revisited. This alone signaled a profound shift in mindset, the kind rarely visible in early interrogations. For many Japanese POWs, the emotional aftermath of learning the true state of Allied cities was complex. These were not trained propagandists or hardened ideologues. Most were support personnel, medics, clerks, aides, women who had served out of duty, expectation, or patriotic upbringing. Yet the gap between propaganda and reality hit them with the same force it had hit countless male prisoners before them. Reports filed in Guam, Tinian, and Okinawa described similar reactions: quiet withdrawal, prolonged silence, and a visible change in body language. Interrogators understood these signs well. Doubt had set in, a doubt that often made captives more willing to speak, but also more emotionally fragile. For the nurse, the realization was the heaviest. She had spent months treating horrific injuries on Saipan and had witnessed civilians suffering from shortages and bombing. She knew Japan was struggling long before her capture, but she had always believed the suffering was mutual, that the enemy endured equal hardship. Now, staring at a photograph of a peaceful American neighborhood, she understood the imbalance for the first time. Her reaction, noted in the interrogation summary, was subdued and reflective. She asked very few questions afterward. She simply stared at the images as if trying to understand the world beyond them, a world she had been shielded from since childhood. The communications clerk reacted differently. Her training in analyzing coded messages and enemy broadcasts made her particularly sensitive to inconsistencies. As the hours passed, she began revisiting every military update she had ever received, comparing them in her mind to the undeniable evidence laid before her. Her posture shifted from defensive to analytical, her eyes tracing newspaper headlines that described production increases, wartime rationing, and industrial output. One report noted, "She appears to be calculating the war's direction with new information." It was not an emotional collapse. It was recalibration. For her, the aftermath was strategic, not sentimental. The youngest woman, the aide, struggled the most. Her reaction was noted as emotionally distressed, but cooperative. She grew quiet, occasionally touching the edges of the photographs as though they might vanish if she looked away. The interpreter recorded one detail. She kept turning back to a photograph of a schoolyard in Melbourne, children playing under the shade of tall eucalyptus trees. Something about that image held her attention longer than the rest. It reminded her, perhaps, of what wartime Japan had lost. To Allied analysts, scenes like this were not just moments of shock, they were data. The psychological state of prisoners provided insight into the broader morale within the Japanese home front. And the contrast was stark. While Allied cities remained largely untouched, Japan's cities were entering the most destructive final phase of the war. Firebombing raids had already devastated urban centers. Supplies were dangerously low. Communications were breaking down. The photographs the women had seen, simple pictures of normal life, represented a truth that Japanese civilians were rarely allowed to know. The war effort was overwhelmingly one-sided in industrial capacity, and Japan's position was far weaker than its population believed. In the days that followed, the three women were moved to a larger holding area with other POWs. Their behavior changed noticeably. They spoke more softly, asked more questions about the war's progress, and no longer repeated slogans or patriotic claims common among newly captured prisoners. They avoided making definitive statements about Japan's future. Some intelligence reports described it as a quiet detachment, the first stage of psychological realignment. The aftermath of that interrogation did not end in that room. It continued in the subtle shifts of posture, in the hesitating tone of their voices, in the long silences that followed simple questions about home. For these women, the war had not ended with their capture. It had ended with the photographs. And the consequences of that realization would deepen further in the next phase, when they learned how badly Japan's own cities had suffered. The transformation that began in the interrogation room did not fade with time. It sharpened. As the women settled into the broader POW enclosure, a converted military compound under the administration of U.S. Navy personnel, the contrast between Allied organization and their expectations deepened the rupture created by those photographs. Allied camps in the Pacific were not comfortable places. They were utilitarian, strictly regulated, and often overcrowded. But for prisoners taken from collapsing island garrisons, the camps felt strangely stable. Meals arrived at predictable hours. Medical staff checked on them routinely. There were rules, yes, but also a sense of order they had not felt in months. The women noticed everything. The nurse observed the medical station first. Supplies were limited but clean. Staff moved with calm efficiency, charting injuries and ailments on proper forms. It contrasted sharply with the cave hospitals of Saipan, where she had worked with improvised equipment under constant bombardment. She recorded a quiet astonishment in her posture, which the guards noted in daily reports. Her worldview continued to shift, not because of ideology, but because of simple observation. The communications clerk spent time watching the logistics within the camp. She studied how Allied units coordinated food deliveries, how mail arrived regularly, how personnel rotated shifts without apparent confusion. She had grown up hearing that American forces were disorganized and lacked discipline. Yet here, even thousands of miles from the mainland, their systems ran with precision. For her, the aftermath became a study in operational truth. The war she had prepared for, the enemy she had expected, did not match the reality she witnessed firsthand. The youngest of the three struggled the most with the psychological aftermath. In the first nights after their transfer, guards reported that she woke frequently, sometimes whispering to herself. The contrast between the peaceful Allied images and the uncertainty facing her own homeland weighed heavily on her mind. She asked for newspapers, not propaganda leaflets, but official Allied press, hoping for some mention of Japan's situation. What she read instead only deepened her anxiety. Reports listed Japanese cities struck by air raids, industrial zones crippled, evacuation trains overflowing, firestorms sweeping through entire districts. The names Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe appeared repeatedly, each accompanied by casualty estimates and descriptions of destruction on a scale she had never imagined. The stark difference between those battered urban centers and the untouched Allied cities in the photographs struck her with the force of an emotional blow. Her hands trembled as she read. These were the realities she had never been allowed to know. To American analysts, her reaction was not unusual. Many female POWs, particularly those from support roles, were kept shielded from the true scale of Japan's losses. Their shock, confusion, and eventual acceptance provided critical insight into the morale inside Japan's civilian population during the final year of the war. The intelligence value was not in the details they offered, but in their emotional responses. The nurse eventually asked to send a postcard through the Red Cross system. She wrote carefully, aware that censors on both sides would read every word. She avoided mentioning the photographs or the interrogation. Instead, she wrote a single line that revealed everything. "I hope you are safe. It was the closest she could come to acknowledging the truth, that she no longer believed safety was possible in Japan's cities. Weeks passed. More newspapers arrived. More news unfolded. The interrogators provided updates when asked. They did not force the women to speak. They allowed their questions to grow naturally. And the questions did grow, about food shortages, about communications failures, about the worsening air raids. Each new fact widened the gulf between their former beliefs and the reality unfolding in front of them. By midsummer, when news reached the camp that Tokyo had endured another catastrophic firebombing, the shift within the three women was complete. The clerk asked quietly if Japan could still negotiate. The nurse wondered aloud whether evacuation plans existed for families in coastal cities. The youngest woman stopped asking about victory altogether. Their thoughts no longer revolved around battlefield outcomes. They revolved around survival. The images they had seen in that interrogation hut, peaceful streets, unbroken skylines, children walking to school, now represented something far larger. The lives their own families no longer had. And the emotional weight of that realization lingered long after the interrogation ended. For these women, the aftermath became not a question of who would win the war, but what would be left of their country when the war finally ended. The next stage in their journey would no longer be shaped by photographs or interrogations, but by the war's approaching conclusion. And the final reflection on this moment reveals what their reactions truly meant, not just for them, but for the understanding of propaganda, perception, and human vulnerability in wartime. The photographs remained long after the war ended, preserved in intelligence files and archival boxes. They were simple images: street corners, schoolyards, markets, families walking beneath clean skies. Yet their impact on the women who saw them was profound. Not because they depicted anything extraordinary, but because they showed the one thing wartime propaganda had made unthinkable: normal life. For the three prisoners, the images created a fracture in the worldview they had carried since childhood. They had entered the war believing Japan fought from equal footing, that hardship was shared on both sides, that sacrifice had meaning because victory was possible. In a single afternoon, those certainties slipped away. What replaced them was not admiration for the Allies, nor rejection of their homeland, but a deeper, quieter understanding of the war's truth. They realized that information had power, far greater than any weapon they had seen. The war had been shaped not only by battles and technology, but by perceptions carefully constructed and fiercely protected. In Japan, civilians had been shielded from the destruction consuming their cities, while being told the enemy suffered even more. The photographs revealed the opposite. The Allies endured rationing and shortages, but their industrial cores remained intact, their cities unbroken, their morale steady. This contrast, this imbalance, became the emotional pivot for countless POWs who encountered similar evidence. It forced them to confront the distance between belief and reality, between the world they imagined and the one that existed. History often remembers the Pacific War through battles, commanders, strategies, and devastation. But moments like this, quiet, private, deeply human, reveal another dimension. They show how war shapes minds as much as it destroys landscapes. They remind us that soldiers and civilians alike are vulnerable not only to bullets, but to narratives that define what they believe is true. For the three women, the photographs became their turning point. For history, they serve as a reminder that truth, even when delivered in the simplest form, can reshape the human understanding of war. And in that small room on Guam, truth arrived not with force, but with a photograph of a peaceful street thousands of miles away.